The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Meadowbrook Care Home, casting delicate shadows that danced across the worn floral wallpaper. In the corner of the common room, where she always sat, Eleanor Whitman held court with her story. Her fingers, gnarled with age but still graceful, traced invisible patterns on the armrest of her chair as her voice carried the familiar cadence of a tale told 10,000 times. "He had the most beautiful eyes," she whispered, her own eyes distant, gazing somewhere beyond the walls that contained her body, but could never contain her memories. Green like spring grass after rain, and when he smiled, when he smiled, it was like the whole world suddenly made sense. The other residents had heard this story so many times, they could recite it themselves. Margaret, in the wheelchair beside her, rolled her eyes skyward, while Harold at the chess table shook his head with the gentle exasperation of someone who had long given up trying to reason with the unreasonable. Even the young nurses, busy with their afternoon medication rounds, had learned to simply nod and murmur appropriate responses, while their minds wandered to more pressing concerns. But Eleanor continued as she always did, her voice carrying the unwavering conviction of someone who had lived with this truth for over 60 years. She spoke of a dance hall in 1943, of a soldier on leave with 2 weeks before shipping out to the Pacific. She spoke of promises whispered in the shadow of war, of a love that bloomed fierce and fast in the face of an uncertain future. "He promised he'd come back," she said, her voice stronger now, defiant against the skepticism that surrounded her like morning fog. "He looked right into my eyes and said, 'Eleanor, I'll find you. No matter how long it takes, no matter what happens, I'll find you.'" The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, exchanged a knowing glance with the head nurse. They had discussed Eleanor's case many times in their weekly meetings. The woman had been telling the same story since she arrived at Meadowbrook 15 years ago, and according to her family, she had been telling it long before that. There were no records, no letters, no photographs. Her late husband, God rest his soul, had apparently learned to live with his wife's romantic delusion, but their children found it increasingly difficult to bear. "Mother's getting worse," her daughter Janet had confided during her last visit, wringing her hands as she watched Eleanor stare out the window with that expectant look that never seemed to fade. "She's so convinced this man is real. The doctors say it's a form of confabulation, you know, the mind creating memories to fill in gaps. It's heartbreaking, really." But Eleanor seemed untouched by the gentle dismissals and concerned whispers. She would spend hours by the window, watching the entrance to Meadowbrook with the patience of someone who had learned that time moves differently when you're waiting for the most important thing in the world. Her fingers would worry the thin gold band on her ring finger, the one she claimed was not from her husband, but from her soldier, though everyone knew it was the same ring she'd worn through 43 years of marriage to Robert Whitman. The seasons changed outside her window. Spring arrived with its hopeful green, summer blazed with its fierce heat, autumn painted the world in fire, and winter wrapped everything in contemplative white. But Eleanor's vigil never wavered. She would rise each morning, dress carefully in her best clothes, and take her place by the window or in her chair, ready for the day he would finally come. The staff had grown fond of her, despite her stubborn adherence to what they all believed was fantasy. She was kind, intelligent when not speaking of her soldier, and possessed a dignity that commanded respect, even when her words seemed to spring from the depths of wishful thinking. Dr. Morrison, the facility's psychiatrist, had noted in her file that while Eleanor showed signs of mild cognitive decline, she remained remarkably lucid on all subjects, except this one persistent delusion. "It's not uncommon," he had explained to the family. "Sometimes the mind holds on to one beautiful impossibility as a way of coping with loss or disappointment. The war was a traumatic time for many young women. She may have created this memory as a way of processing feelings she couldn't otherwise handle." On this particular October afternoon, as the leaves outside painted themselves in shades of memory and the air carried the crisp promise of winter, Eleanor sat in her usual spot, her story floating around the room like incense. The common room was quieter than usual. Several residents were napping, their gentle snores providing a drowsy soundtrack to the afternoon. The television played an old movie, its volume low enough to be ignored, but present enough to fill the silences between Eleanor's words. "We danced to I'll Be Seeing You," she continued, her voice taking on the dreamy quality it always assumed when she reached this part of her story. "The band was playing and everyone was dancing, but it felt like we were the only two people in the world. He was so tall, and when he held me, I felt safer than I'd ever felt before or since." Nurse Williams, checking Eleanor's blood pressure, had heard this story countless times, but something in the old woman's voice today gave her pause. There was a quality of anticipation that seemed different, more immediate somehow, as if Eleanor wasn't just recounting a memory, but preparing for something yet to come. "He had to leave the next morning," Eleanor whispered, her fingers moving to her throat, where she always claimed he had fastened a locket, though she wore no jewelry except the mysterious ring. "He kissed me goodbye at the train station, and he said he'd carry me in his heart until the day he could carry me in his arms again." The front desk telephone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the afternoon quiet. Mrs. Patterson answered with her practiced professional cheerfulness, her voice carrying across the room as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. Eleanor seemed not to notice, lost in her memories, but something in the conversation made Nurse Williams look up from her blood pressure cuff. "Yes, we do have an Eleanor Whitman here," Mrs. Patterson was saying, her tone shifting from routine to curious. "May I ask who's calling?" "I see. And you say you have information about... Well, that's quite unusual. Would you be able to come in person?" "Yes, today would be fine. We're here until 8. Eleanor's head turned sharply toward the front desk, her entire body suddenly alert in a way that surprised everyone who witnessed it. For 60 years she had waited with the patient stillness of someone who knew her time would come. But now, something electric seemed to run through her frame, as if every cell in her body had suddenly awakened from a long sleep. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of urgency that no one had heard from her before. Mrs. Patterson looked uncertain, glancing between Eleanor and the other staff members as if seeking guidance for a situation no training had prepared her for. It was a gentleman asking about you specifically. He said he had some old photographs he thought you might want to see." The words hung in the air like suspended breath. For a moment, the entire common room seemed to hold its collective silence, even the television's gentle murmur fading into insignificance. Eleanor's face had gone pale, then flushed with color, her hands trembling as they gripped the arms of her chair. "Photographs?" she whispered, and in that single word was contained 60 years of hope, fear, doubt, and unwavering faith. The afternoon crawled by, with excruciating slowness. Eleanor could not be persuaded to eat her dinner, could not be coaxed away from her position facing the entrance. She sat rigid with anticipation, every sound in the hallway causing her to turn toward the door with breathless expectation. The staff moved around her with unusual gentleness, uncertain how to handle what felt like a moment, balanced on the edge of either miracle or heartbreak. Dr. Morrison arrived for his evening rounds earlier than usual, having been called by Mrs. Patterson about the unusual circumstances. He observed Eleanor from a distance, noting the change in her demeanor, the electric quality of her attention that was so unlike her usual patient dreaming. "This could be difficult," he murmured to Nurse Williams. "If this turns out to be nothing significant, the disappointment could be devastating for her." But Nurse Williams, who had worked with elderly patients for over 20 years, saw something in Eleanor's bearing that gave her pause. "I don't know, Doctor. I've never seen her like this. It's like she's awakening from something." At 7:37, just as the dinner dishes were being cleared and the evening shift was settling into their routines, the front door opened. A man stepped through, tall and lean despite his evident age, his silver hair catching the hallway light. He moved with the careful precision of someone in his 80s, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of a vitality that age had not diminished. In his hands he carried a small wooden box and a manila envelope, thick with what appeared to be photographs. Mrs. Patterson rose to greet him, but her words of welcome died in her throat as she saw Eleanor's reaction. The old woman had gone completely still, her face transformed by an expression of recognition so profound it seemed to change the very air around her. She rose from her chair with a grace that belied her 93 years, her entire being focused on the man standing in the doorway. "Jimmy," she whispered, the word barely audible, but carrying such weight that everyone in the room turned to look. The man's eyes found hers across the space of the common room, and in that gaze was reflected the same recognition, the same profound stirring of memory made manifest. His face, lined with age and marked by the passage of decades, transformed with a smile that seemed to illuminate him from within. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the trace of an accent that spoke of distant places and long journeys. "I told you I'd find you." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Even the television seemed to have hushed itself in respect for the moment unfolding. Eleanor stood frozen, her hands pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her cheeks in rivers of joy and disbelief and recognition. "But you're old," she said, and then laughed, a sound like bells that had not rung for decades suddenly finding their voice again. "You're supposed to be young. In my mind, you were always young." He moved toward her, slowly, respectfully, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're both old now, Ellie, but I kept my promise. It just took me a little longer than I thought it would." The staff watched in stunned silence as Eleanor walked toward him, with steps that grew steadier with each movement, as if approaching him was returning her to herself in a way that nothing had for years. When they stood before each other, he reached into his envelope and withdrew a photograph, its edges worn soft with age. "I've carried this with me for 70 years, he said, showing her the image. In the photograph, a young woman in a blue dress danced with a soldier in uniform, their faces bright with joy and possibility. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the picture, seeing proof of what everyone had told her was impossible. "How?" she whispered. "How is this real? How are you here?" He smiled, and in that smile was the echo of the young man she had danced with so many decades ago. "It's a long story, Ellie, but the short version is that I tried to come back. I tried so many times. I was wounded in the Pacific, spent 2 years in a hospital in the Philippines. When I finally made it home, you were gone. Married, they said. I spent years looking for you, but Eleanor Morrison had become Eleanor Whitman, and I didn't know to look for that name." He reached into his wooden box and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it he pulled a delicate silver locket, its surface tarnished with age, but still beautiful. "I never stopped looking, though, and I never stopped carrying this." Eleanor's hands shook as she recognized the locket he had fastened around her neck that last night, the one she had lost in the chaos of her hasty marriage to Robert, the one she had claimed to wear for 60 years, even though no one could see it. She turned around, and with trembling fingers, he fastened it around her neck once more. "I'm sorry it took so long," he whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise the way I meant to. But I never stopped trying, Ellie. Even when everyone told me to give up, even when I thought you might not remember me, I never stopped looking." She turned to face him, her fingers touching the locket that now rested against her heart, solid and real and warm with his touch. "I never forgot," she said, her voice strong now, clear with the conviction that had sustained her through decades of doubt. "Not for one day, not for one moment. They all thought I was crazy. But I knew you'd come back." The common room had become a cathedral of witnessing, every person present understanding that they were observing something extraordinary, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about love and time and the power of promises made in youth. Dr. Morrison stood with his clipboard forgotten in his hands, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Nurse Williams openly wept, her professional composure abandoned in the face of such profound reunion. Eleanor and Jimmy stood together in the center of the room, 2 people in their 90s who had suddenly found themselves transported back to that dance hall in 1943, when they were young and the world was at war, and love was the only thing that mattered. He took her hand, the same hand he had held 70 years ago, and she felt the familiar warmth that had haunted her dreams for 6 decades. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, and without waiting for the music that wasn't there, they began to move together in the gentle swaying rhythm of people who had been dancing together their entire lives, even when they were apart. As they danced, he told her his story in whispered fragments. How he had spent the war years dreaming of her. How he had searched every Eleanor Morrison in every phone book for decades. How he had finally found her through a genealogy website her granddaughter had created, tracking her through her maiden name and her marriage to Robert, How he had spent the last year gathering his courage, wondering if she would remember, if she would want to see him, if his promise could possibly still matter after so many years. "It never stopped mattering," she whispered against his shoulder as they moved together in their careful ancient dance. "It was the most important thing that ever happened to me. Even when I married Robert, even when I had children and grandchildren and a whole life, you were always there. The love we had, it was like a light that never went out." The evening deepened around them, but no one suggested that visiting hours were over, that it was time for residents to return to their rooms. This was beyond the ordinary rules that governed life at Meadowbrook. This was something sacred, something that demanded its own time and space. Eventually, they settled together on the couch near the window where Eleanor had spent so many hours watching for his return. Jimmy opened his wooden box and showed her the treasures he had carried. Letters she had written him during those 2 weeks of courtship, pressed flowers from the corsage he had given her, the ticket stub from the movie they had seen together. Each item was a piece of proof that their love had been real, substantial, worthy of a lifetime's faith. "I never remarried," he told her quietly as they sat close together, their hands intertwined. "I dated, I had relationships, but nobody was ever you, Ellie. I kept thinking, what if she's waiting? What if she remembers? What if I give up just one day too soon?" Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the impossible reality of his presence. "I was faithful to you in my heart," she said. "Robert was a good man, and I tried to love him the way he deserved, but there was always a part of me that belonged to you. It's always a part of me that was still that girl in the blue dress, dancing with her soldier." They talked through the evening and into the night, filling in the gaps of 70 years with stories and memories and explanations. The staff created a respectful bubble of privacy around them, bringing them tea and blankets, but otherwise leaving them to navigate this reunion that no one could have imagined. As the hours passed, it became clear that Jimmy had not come simply to fulfill an old promise and then disappear again. He had come to stay, to spend whatever time remained to them together, to finally claim the life they had been meant to share. He had already spoken to the administration about moving into Meadowbrook, had already begun the process of arranging his affairs so that he could be near Eleanor for whatever time they had left. "We're old," Eleanor said as the first light of dawn began to touch the windows, her voice wondering but not sad. "We missed our whole lives together." Jimmy squeezed her hand gently, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "We didn't miss it, Ellie. We lived it differently, that's all. We loved each other across distance and time and every obstacle that tried to keep us apart. That's not missing life. That's proving that love is stronger than anything the world can throw at it." The morning shift began to arrive, and word of the night's events spread through Meadowbrook like wildfire. Eleanor's family was called, and they arrived in various states of shock, disbelief, and grudging amazement. Her daughter Janet stared at Jimmy with the wide eyes of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally altered. "The photographs," Janet whispered, looking through the evidence Jimmy had brought. "They're real. The story is real. All these years you thought I was crazy," Eleanor said gently, without accusation. "I understand why. It did sound impossible, but impossible things happen every day. We just don't always recognize them when they do." Dr. Morrison examined the photographs with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile scientific skepticism with undeniable evidence. "This changes everything we thought we knew about Eleanor's condition," he admitted. "This wasn't confabulation or false memory. This was faith. This was love maintaining itself across 7 decades. In the days that followed, as Jimmy settled into his new room just down the hall from Eleanor's, their story spread beyond the walls of Meadowbrook. Local newspapers picked it up, then regional ones, then national media, hungry for a story that proved love could conquer time itself. But Eleanor and Jimmy barely noticed the attention. They were too busy making up for lost time, too absorbed in the miracle of their reunion to care about anything beyond the simple joy of being together. They spent their days talking and remembering, walking in the gardens behind Meadowbrook, their steps slow but steady as they navigated both the present and the past. Jimmy had brought his old guitar, and in the evenings he would play the songs they had danced to in 1943, his voice still carrying the melody, even if it was now roughened by age. "I'll be seeing you" became their evening ritual, Eleanor humming along as Jimmy's fingers found the familiar chords. Other residents would gather to listen, drawn by the sweetness of the music and the obvious love that flowed between the two old people who had found each other again after a lifetime apart. 3 months after Jimmy's arrival, as winter settled over Meadowbrook and the world outside grew quiet with snow, Eleanor fell ill. It was nothing sudden or dramatic, just the gentle failing that comes to bodies that have lived long and full lives. Jimmy never left her side, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness, talking to her about their plans for spring, about the garden they would plant together, about all the dances they still had ahead of them. On a Tuesday morning in February, as the sun painted the snow outside her window in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at Jimmy with perfect clarity. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. "I kept my faith all these years, and look what happened. Love is stronger than anything, Jimmy, even this." He kissed her forehead, his own eyes bright with tears, but not with despair. "I'll find you again, Ellie," he promised, echoing the words he had spoken so many years ago. "No matter what comes next, I'll find you." She smiled, the same radiant smile that had captivated him in 1943, and closed her eyes for the last time. Jimmy held her hand as she slipped away, peaceful and complete, surrounded by the love that had sustained her for 93 years. Jimmy followed her 6 weeks later, dying quietly in his sleep with Eleanor's photograph clutched in his hands and her locket around his neck. The staff at Meadowbrook found them both that way, together even in death, proof that some promises are so powerful they transcend every boundary the world tries to impose. Their story became legend at Meadowbrook, told and retold by staff and residents who had witnessed the impossible made manifest. But more than that, it became hope. It became proof that faith rewarded, that love honored, that promises kept have power beyond measure. In the end, Eleanor Whitman had not been delusional at all. She had simply been a woman who understood something that the rest of the world had forgotten, that true love once kindled never dies. It may be separated by distance, obscured by time, doubted by others, but it endures, it waits, it believes. And sometimes, if we are very lucky and very faithful, it is rewarded with the miracle of reunion, the blessing of promises fulfilled, the profound joy of love that conquers all. The dance hall where they first met was long gone, demolished decades ago to make way for progress, but the love that began there proved more durable than stone or steel. It lived in an old woman's unwavering faith, in a soldier's lifelong search, in the power of a promise made in youth and honored in age. It lived and it endured, and it reminded everyone who heard their story that some things are indeed stronger than time itself. Love, it turns out, is one of them.